Okay, hello again, Ling 341. Today we are going to have a relatively short lecture on the cardinal vowels, which is a bit of a, artifact of an old way of doing phonetics, but it's still something valuable for you to know. And in so doing, we're going to go through a bit of a review about what we already know about vowels to some extent. So remember, we just went through a couple of lectures on the dimensions of consonant articulation, and before that we talked briefly about the various dimensions of vowel articulation. So the first two of these dimensions describe where your tongue body is, or where the highest point in your tongue body is when you produce a vowel. The first dimension being height, so that highest arch of your tongue body can be high, mid, or low, and then that highest arch of the front body can be either front, towards the front of your vocal tract, or further back. The sort of dimensionality here, or the space that's being defined by this dimensions that describes these dimensions is defined by your vocal tract itself. So when I'm talking about like your tongue body being high, that means it's high within your vocal tract or within your mouth. If it's low within your vocal tract, or basically down in your pharynx somewhere. And front back is the same sort of thing. We talked about how front means anterior in your body towards your face, and back means posterior towards your back, right? Then we also talked about two other dimensions. There's rounding. You can either round your lips or not round them. And then there's this other kind of funny one, which breaks vowels down into whether or not they're tense or they're lax. And I'll have something more to say about that dimension here in a second. But if we just look at those first two dimensions, you can plot out all the vowels we know in kind of, I guess it's a quadrilateral of some sort, a vowel space quadrilateral that's broken down into two dimensions from front to back, here from left to right, and then also from high to low, or as it's labeled in the IPA chart itself, from close to open. So close just means that your vocal tract is narrower, or the open space in your vocal tract when you produce a vowel is relatively narrow. You're closing your mouth more for an E or an OO. And then if it's more open or low, then you're opening up the vocal tract more. So you can produce like an ah with a really open mouth, basically, right? In this particular chart, I've got plotted the various vowel phonemes of English, with some of the interesting variations down here in the low part of the vowel space that may or may not be in your variety of English. I've also added this guy here, which is called a barred I. I'll say more about him in a second, but that's a high central vowel. So up until now, we've basically only looked at schwa as the only central vowel that we know. It's also mid-central. It's kind of right in the middle of your vowel space. So your kind of default position when you produce a vowel, if you remember when we looked at those X-ray videos, I said when you start to speak, you kind of put your articulators in kind of a speech-ready position. And when you do that, you're basically putting your tongue in an appropriate position for schwa, somewhere in the middle of all your different possibilities of articulation. And then from there, you can push your tongue or lips or whatever around to get to the various parts of this space. So everything that's not schwa is going to be higher or lower than that, or more front or back than that. Okay, so that's where we get this vowel space. It's describing where your tongue is, basically, when you produce a vowel in two dimensions. Then we have these other two dimensions as well. We have rounding. So in English, we have oo, o, and o. That are produced with rounded lips. If you have this aw vowel down here, aw, that's a sweet little puppy, then yeah, that's rounded too, a little bit, on top of being low and back. The other English vowels, however, are not rounded consistently. So if we look at all these guys, except for these ones over here on the right, every single one of the other ones is going to be unrounded. Then we also have this tenseness dimension, and basically, articulatorily, you can think about it as a tense vowel. You're supposed to put more effort into it articulatorily, kind of tensing up your articulators, your tongue, or your muscles that you use to push air out of your lungs, so on and so forth. So you put a little more effort into it. But another way to think about it, which might be more useful and more appropriate for this sort of dimensional representation of vowels, is that tense vowels are going to be closer to the perimeter of the space. So if schwa is kind of the ultimate lax vowel, you're putting like no effort into it at all by just kind of using your default speech position and saying, and then based on that, the more effort you put into producing a vowel like oo or e, so on and so forth, the closer you're going to get to sort of the perimeter of the space. So e is going to be a tense vowel. You have to put more effort to get out there. And then I is going to be a lax vowel. It doesn't take as much sort of articulatory tenseness or tension to get to that spot. Similarly, oo is a tense vowel. Is a lax vowel. The way this kind of pans out, looking at this dimensionality, is that tense vowels are closer to the edge of the vowel space, and lax vowels are going to be closer to the center, closer to schwa, basically. It's still kind of a funny distinction to make, though. It would be nice if you could just like pin down one thing that you could either feel in your mouth when you're producing it or like measure in some particular way, but that's not basically how this works in the grand scheme of things. What you need to get for tense and lax vowels in a language is a distinction of some sort, basically. So if a vowel, like, we have an A vowel in English, we have an E vowel in English, a lot of languages are not going to make that distinction. So what they often wind up with is some vowel kind of in the middle of those two, which to English speaking ears will not sound particularly like A or E will not sound specifically like either one of those vowels. It might sound like it's somewhere in between. It can kind of, fool your mind sometimes. You think, well, isn't that A sometimes? And then sometimes it'll sound like or what have you. So anyways, these distinctions are not that common. So they're found predominantly in Germanic languages and a few others. And so we have them in English, and like they exist in German, so on and so forth. But they're not easy for somebody who doesn't have these vowel distinctions in their native language to hear. So if you have to learn English and you happen to be like my wife, who's a Ukrainian speaker from birth, it's hard for her to like pick those apart, just as it's difficult for me to pick apart certain vowel distinctions in Ukrainian, which I was not born with natively. So in particular, Ukrainian has this high central BART I vowel, and it's hard for me to pick that one apart from the I right here. Talk about that more later, as I said before, though. So there are 5 lax vowels that can be stressed in English. So if you are having a hard time kind of determining the difference between tense and lax vowels, I'm just going to walk you through it step by step here. So each lax vowel kind of has a tense vowel counterpart, sort of. So heed and hid, I talked about these two before, but E is kind of the tense vowel counterpart of I, which is also a high front vowel, just not as high in front as E. A kind of goes along with so heed and head. You can think of those as a pair. Hood, the U goes along with the and hood. The in hod goes along with the wedge and hud. So this one's lax, this one's tense. And then lastly, we have O and this one really isn't a pair, but is a lax vowel as well. And one thing that's interesting about all these lax vowels is that they, generally speaking, can't appear at the end of a syllable in English. So go ahead and try to think of a word or a syllable that ends in I or I think you might be thinking for a while. And that trick actually also used to work for a long time for and then I don't know how long ago it was, 10, 15 years ago, The Simpsons came up with this word meh. So now we have meh to just kind of use as an expression to capture our feelings about the fact that The Simpsons invented the word meh. And meh, whatever. You guys just ruined my demo for Linguistics 341. Anyways, generally speaking, you can't have these at the end of a syllable by itself, or like the end of a word. And if you do try to produce these kind of at the end of a syllable with nothing else after it, what will often happen is that native English speakers will produce them with a schwa off glide. So like if you try to say hi, it's hard to say just hi. Usually we'll say here. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But in that particular case, you'd be saying something like here, or he. There's a reason we don't say these things. They sound kind of ridiculous. But anyways, that's one distinction we can get between tense and lax. That's kind of a phonologically based distinction. It's just the way the language patterns. But then there's also a phonetic pattern or more acoustic pattern such that these lax vowels are going to be shorter than their tense counterparts. So heed and hid, close to the same vowel quality, not quite the same. But either way, we'd expect these vowels to be longer in front of a voiced stop at the end of the syllable. But E is still going to be longer than I generally anyways. So heed should sound longer than hid. Yeah, and it's a tense vowel. So you can kind of go back to that articulatory definition of it again and think, well, if I'm putting more effort into the tense vowel, if I'm sort of pushing my articulators to the further edges of the space, then it should take me longer to kind of get there, or to, as a way to represent that I'm putting more effort into it, I should be holding it longer than I will with like a lax vowel like I. Yeah, so heed and hid. This one's longer, or this entire column is longer. And so I will mention again, say if you are not native speaker of English and it's tricky for you to kind of get a handle on this distinction, you could, like my wife, just kind of rely on that vowel duration distinction between the two. It's pretty easy to produce some vowels longer than others, even if you can't really hear the quality difference between them. So if you just say, like, if you have this vowel E in your native phonemic inventory and you want to say hid, you could just say like a really short E in this context, heed, as opposed to heed. And that might sound more like E or I to native English speakers' ears, and you can get away with that. Usually in context it works just fine. And it's not that common for people to be able to, communicate successfully with this, even though it's difficult if you just boil it down to these phonetic differences at the lowest level, I guess, of language. With all this in mind, though, I want to talk a little bit about the cardinal vowels. So this is a set of so-called reference vowels, 8 in one primary set, and then there's 8 in the secondary set as well. They were the brainchild of this English phonetician Daniel Jones, and I've got a picture of him here, I guess, in his study, doing phonetic-y things. So he lived in the early part of the 20th century, back in the good old days of phonetics, when we didn't have fancy tools like prot or computers or anything other than just, our ears, our tongues, and a sense of like what those two things were doing in our heads. So Daniel Jones was kind of the preeminent scholar of phonetics at the time, and he came up with this system of the cardinal vowels, and also came up with kind of neat little tricks such that he said, you can't learn about the cardinal vowels unless you learn them from me. I'm the master. You have to be my pupil in order for you to understand what's going on. So this is a direct quote. Cardinal vowels can only be learned from a teacher who knows how to make them, or from a gramophone record or a tape record, right? If you're so lucky to have such things in, 1935. Anyways, so in case you're worried about this, I'll give you a little bit of phonetics history here. So Daniel Jones's teacher himself was a guy named Henry Sweet. So he was working, I guess, even earlier than the early 20th century. And Henry Sweet was the inspiration for the character of Henry Higgins, the professor in My Fair Lady, or Pygmalion, the play or movie by George Bernard Shaw. Maybe you've seen it. It stars Rex Harrison and Audrey Hepburn in the 1960s film version. It's kind of fun and also kind of extremely obnoxious if you know anything about phonetics or linguistics. But anyways, Henry Sweet, who didn't really like the play, by the way, taught phonetics to Daniel Jones. Then Daniel Jones taught phonetics to a guy named David Abercrombie, who was Scottish and worked kind of in the middle of the 20th century. David Abercrombie had this student, Peter Ladefoged, who you know through the textbook for this course, and he was influential kind of in the later 20th century. One of Peter Ladefoged's students was Sarah Dart, who was one of his students at UCLA. I went out to Southern California for college, and Sarah Dart was my professor, and she taught me about the cardinal vowels. And it turns out that right now, I'm teaching you. So there's a direct connection between us and the master himself, so we don't have to worry. We're going to learn these perfectly, and in fact, it probably won't even take that much time. We don't need either a gramophone or a tape record to do it. Okay, so let's learn about the cardinal vowels. There are 8 of them that we're going to start off with, and there's 2 anchor vowels, and you kind of think about this going back to the sense of like schwa being like a default vowel, and then if you want to produce a tense vowel, you kind of have to push your articulators to like the extremes of the space. So E, which we know now is a tense vowel, is going to be the highest frontist vowel you can possibly produce. So that's called cardinal vowel 1. And you can try this. And what I mean by the most front or the most high vowel you can produce is that you're pushing your tongue up into a high front position. And if you go any further with it, if you make it even like higher or fronter, you'll start to make a fricative. You kind of want to hit that point and then not go past it. So you can make like an E like we normally do in English, and then you can kind of focus on tensing up your tongue and pushing it higher and fronter and making E, E, and then kind of playing around with it until you get an E. There's a point in there where you start to hear a frication, right? It starts to sound like a voiced fricative. E. But that's your anchor vowel. That's cardinal vowel number 1, is the highest frontist E you can produce. And then ah is kind of on the other side or the other corner of the vowel space from that. That's the lowest and backest vowel you can possibly produce. So it's ah. It's not just a regular like ah, like in father. It just get your tongue all the way down, lower your jaw, and push it far back into your pharynx before you make a fricative, and just say ah, ah. Get it way down there, and now you know kind of what the limits of your articulatory space are, basically. So the remaining vowels of the 8 are going to be spaced at equal intervals of frontness and height between those anchor vowels. And then there's also a third one, which is the vowel U. It's labeled as cardinal vowel 8. The numbers go in kind of a counterclockwise direction. You'll see it in the vowel space in a second. But cardinal vowel 8 is U, and that's the highest, backest, roundest vowel you can possibly produce. So that gets the third dimension involved with this too. So ooh, ooh, something like that, where your tongue is really far back, your tongue is also really high, and then your lips are as tightly rounded as you can possibly make them without making a fricative. Ooh. Yeah. It may sound funny when I'm doing that, maybe it doesn't, but it turns out Daniel Jones is going to sound pretty much the same. So I've got these recordings from Daniel Jones. Actually, I originally do have them on a gramophone record, so called. It's an old 78 RPM set, which is pretty cool. It sits in the Phonetics lab, and I never use it because I don't want to wear it out. So actually, somebody else digitized these, and I was able to grab them, and we can listen to them now. And normally in class, we do this as a group, so we feel less silly doing it. You can do it at home and feel as silly as you want for your dog or your sister or whatever. But here we go. This is cardinal vowel number 1. This is the highest frontist vowel that we can produce, and it's Daniel Jones doing it, these vowels himself when he's 75 years old. So this is the real thing.
Number 1. E.
Yeah, and you can kind of hear that old record, scratchy record sound in the back. Here's number 2.
Number 2. E.
A. Number 3.
Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. Number 6. Number 7. Number 8.
All right. So I normally play these in class, and then I ask people, like, do you notice anything funny about this? And yeah, I'd like to ask that now, but there's a variety of things you can kind of pick up on there. One is that like his F0, the pitch of his voice kind of wavers up and down. I think that's just a product of him being a bit older. And he's kind of trying to sing these at a particular pitch anyways, so that like in theory the pitch is kind of removed from the vowel quality and you're just getting them all at the same like pitch level. But because he's older, it's kind of hard for him to like hang on to that exact pitch. His muscles just won't cooperate the way they used to.
Number 7.
And another thing is that you might notice this. Let's compare sort of the loudness of this one.
Number 8.
To this one.
Number 5.
So in theory, you might think about trying to produce them all at the same loudness, but that's not how it shakes out. Turns out.
Number 1.
You can maybe tell me which set you think is louder. I'll just play these 4, and you can tell me where you find the loudest ones and where you find the quietest ones.
Number 1. E. Number 2. E. Number 3. Number 4.
Yeah, so it's a little more dramatic if you're on this side of the vowel space, but basically the higher vowels are going to sound quieter than the lower vowels. And there's a very simple reason why that's the case. Basically, if you're making a high vowel, remember those are close vowels, so you're not opening your mouth all that much. And so there's not as much air coming out of your mouth as you produce them. So they're not going to sound as loud as when you really open your mouth for like a low or open vowel, like ah. There's a lot of space in the front of your mouth for that air to come out into the world and disturb a lot of air molecules.
Number 8.
Ooh. And ooh on top of that has lip rounding, so it usually tends to be really quiet, like ooh. There's not a lot of space there for the amplitude to escape. Okay, there are secondary cardinal vowels as well, and these are basically the same reference vowels in the first set of 8, but you switch your lip rounding position for that. So before we have rounded lips over here for 6, 7, and 8. Everything else is unrounded, sort of like what we see in English. And in this set, these are going to be unrounded in 14, 15, 16, and everything else will be rounded. So we haven't really talked about these vowels yet, but I'm going to play them for you, and I'd recommend that you just like give it your best shot in terms of trying to do the opposite lip rounding. It takes some practice, basically, if you haven't done it before. I'm also going to mention as well that I talked about oo being the roundest vowel you can possibly produce, as that's your third anchor. And the idea is for like o or o, that those have slightly less lip rounding on top of them because you're opening your mouth as you go down. So it's kind of harder to get that same tight constriction on it. But yeah, that's the peak roundedness here, and then you get less and less as you go down. The same thing kind of apply over here to the front vowel. So this one, number 9, is going to be the highest, frontest, roundest vowel you can produce. And let's just give all 8 of these a shot. Don't worry if you can't get it right the first time. It's just kind of fun to try.
Number 9. E. Number 10. E.
So that's like just rounding your lips on top of an A.
Number 11. Number 12. Number 13. Number 14. Number 15. Number 16.
Yeah. I will point out as we go that this vowel, number 12, which looks like a capital O and E squashed
Number
together.
Number 12.
There's no known language which has this vowel. It only exists because Daniel Jones had to create something to make this whole system symmetrical. So it's basically supposed to be this ah.
Number 4.
With lip rounding, but no language does that. So thank you, Daniel Jones. You'll be remembered forever anytime we see this in our lives. Anyways, so what's going on here? Why do we have a primary set and a secondary set? Why is it one way and not the other? There's a variety of reasons for this, and one sort of conspiracy theory idea is that it may be influenced from the late 19th, early 20th century French vowel system. So I've got kind of a minimal set here of French vowels. I'm not a native speaker of French, so normally in class that I will ask somebody if they do speak French, if they can read all of these words for us. And in reality, I should probably just go and get somebody to do that. But this is basically li, le, la, losh, lok, lot, lu. Hopefully that didn't sound too terrible. But the main thing is whether or not in modern French there is a distinction between this 4th and this 5th vowel. This would be more like la, and this would be more like losh. And I don't know if there is for every single French speaker in the modern day. But either way, there's a nice sort of symmetrical pattern for all 8 of these. And they all line up exactly well with the cardinal vowel system, the primary cardinal vowel system. So Daniel Jones was part of that IPA, part of that whole effort to create the alphabet as we know it, or shape it in the form that we now know it as. And so he kind of convinced the International Phonetic Association to sort of use that vowel space sort of diagram that we still use to this day with the two-dimensionality of height versus low and front versus back vowels, because that's how he designed his cardinal vowel system. So there's another note here that French phonetician Paul Passy was the president of the IPA when it adopted the cardinal vowel system for vowel classification. I'm going to add one more point here that I forgot that's actually kind of important. So the idea here, again, is that this cardinal vowel space is kind of telling you where the limits of your vowel production system are. So this is the highest frontist vowel you can produce.
Number 1. E.
And this is the lowest backest vowel you can produce.
Number 5. Ah.
So the idea is, like, if you go back to like 1930, and let's say you want to go out and transcribe some language that nobody's ever transcribed before, and you don't really have like a portable tape recorder at your disposal because it's 1930, well, you can go out and just kind of listen and figure out what vowels people are producing in this language, try to figure out how to produce them yourself, and then, you can use these reference points as a guide for describing like where these vowels are in the articulatory space. So let's, maybe you encounter a language, like Ukrainian, does it have an I or does it have an like here? And then you can say, well, it's close to cardinal vowel 1, but a little bit lower and a little bit backer in the space. Or maybe there's another vowel here that's like but it's higher in the space and it's rounded or something like that. This just kind of gives you an articulatory framework by which you can describe what vowels are doing in a particular language that you want to transcribe. And then you can, think about it in terms of using these symbols, like from the IPA, and then you can use like this diacritics for like fronter or backer or whatever. That was the idea. That was supposed to be the usefulness of this system. And like I said, it's a little more useful when you don't have sort of recording technology available to you. In the modern day and age, you probably are probably always going to have some sort of recording technology available if you really want to use it. So with that in mind, the cardinal vowels are not going to be the vowels of any language. They are reference vowels if you wind up in this sort of situation, or even if you just want to apply them in sort of a bit of an anachronistic method. I'll also mention that there are two central cardinal vowels, and these are called barred I and barred U, and they go up, sorry, I keep flipping back here, they go up here at the top middle part of the space, so the high central location. So there's the unrounded one, U, and then there's the rounded one, U, and they go right in here. They're called barred I and barred U. And I'll give you some examples of Daniel Jones producing them.
Number 17.
And number 18.
Number 18.
Yeah. This one we see a lot in modern English anyways, and you probably have it allophonically in your own variety. Maybe not. This one we find in specific contexts in English as well. It's just hard. We don't kind of use it as sort of like the main peak of a syllable. So it can take a little while to get a hang of how to produce that one. So where we do find barred I is in an unstressed syllable that's closed. So I talked about how we see schwa in unstressed syllables, and primarily we're going to get schwa in unstressed open syllables like about. So this first syllable is just the vowel schwa, and there's nothing else. The B latches on to the syllable after it. But roses, in this particular case, the unstressed vowel or the unstressed syllable is the second one, and it's got a vowel in the middle, and then it's got an S or is the right after it. So because it's closed like that, because you're producing a consonant right after the vowel, it turns out more like an than an so about versus roses, that vowel. And this lecture would not be complete unless I pointed out, for those of you who are old enough to remember such things, that if you have any knowledge or memory of the TV show Beavis and Butthead at all, which is funnier than it may sound if you haven't watched it, but I can't remember which character does this, but I think both of them would laugh in barred I, like, yeah, whatever. They were supposed to be idiots, and we were supposed to laugh at them, but it was funny. So yeah, if you ever see that show, that's a good example of it. Also, I've got examples of these two central vowels from New Zealand and Scottish English as well. So I'll play some Scottish English samples first, which will give you examples of the barred U.
But just a year ago, we moved to Livingston. And it's a new house, and it's in a new street. So it's basically in the middle of nowhere. but it's a new town, and so everything's all spaced out. There are little areas, but they're all spaced out with main roads, and it's not like you can just like go next door and see your friend or whatever.
Yeah, so there's a lot of fun stuff in that. Number one, she doesn't have diphthongs for her O's, so it's just O, road, whatever. She also has like voiceless hua in like where, so on and so forth. But she also has the barred oo in a word like moved. Moved. Like the Saskatoon speaker we heard a while ago has the barred oo in spoons.
Moved.
Yeah, and who knows? Maybe there is a dialectal connection between like Canadian English and Scottish English there. But I'll play the whole segment again so you can hear it in C2.
But just a year ago, we moved to Livingston. And it's a new house, and it's in a new street. So it's basically in the middle of nowhere. But it's a new town, and so everything's all spaced out. There are little areas, but they're all spaced out with main roads. And it's not like you can just like go next door and see your friend or whatever.
Yeah, and she also has Canadian raising in house as opposed to house. And one thing that happens in New Zealand English is that the cap I has moved back to be more of a barred I. So I'll let you listen to this sample of New Zealand English, and you maybe can hear that.
And I knew aphids to be small green insects that lived on plants. I could never figure it out.
Yeah, so if you haven't heard that segment, just hearing it audibly, you might not understand it. But she's talking about insects called aphids. And both of those words, insects and aphids, have a cap I in our variety of English or the Canadian variety of English. And so both of those are shifted back a bit, making this a bit of a challenge to understand if you haven't heard it.
And I knew aphids to be small green insects that lived on plants. I could never figure it out.
Yeah, so here's that last word.
Insects.
Insects as opposed to insects. Yeah, and I usually write this on the board, but I don't have a board right now. So I have a friend from South Africa whose name is Martin, but he doesn't say it that way. And for whatever random reason, both New Zealand and South African English have pushed this vowel back a little bit. And now I'm going to get into trouble because I can't remember the code for this vowel, so I'll just copy it over. But yeah, so South African English is also a non-rhotic variety of English. It got settled after 1700. So he doesn't actually say the R in his name like we would in Canada or the US, not Martin. He says Martin. And he pushes that I back a little bit in the second syllable. So Martin. Right. So I don't know what the connection is there in the Southern Hemisphere exactly between New Zealand and South African English, but they both those varieties do this. So watch out for that. And also I will leave you with a few parting shots. So the cardinal vowels were based on an articulatory three-dimensional characterization of vowels. So it had the dimension of height, it had the dimension of front and backness, and then it had the dimension of lip rounding too. So like I said, like E could be described as a high front unrounded vowel, and then O is a low mid back rounded vowel, so on and so forth. And then tense and laxness just kind of fall out by with respect to like how close you are to the various like reference points of the space. But the main point I want to make here is that this is all like an articulatory description. These are telling you what you're doing with your tongue or with your lips as you produce these vowels. Daniel Jones developed this system in the early 20th century, and it was very influential for some time. But after or during World War II, they invented this technology known as the sound spectrograph, which enabled us to get a better understanding of the acoustics of how vowels sound and are produced as well. And it turns out that the acoustics kind of is more revealing or enlightening to what's going on with vowels than the articulations are. So it's when you kind of are thinking about what am I doing with my tongue when I'm producing a vowel, it can be sometimes a bit hard to feel like where exactly is my tongue or what exactly is going on in there. When we look at what a sound spectrograph can do, we'll be able to see it directly in front of us, and we'll say, oh, that's a high vowel because of this, or that's a front vowel because of this feature, so on and so forth. And because that's a lot easier to sort of understand, and also it's a lot more objective, that sort of approach to understanding vowels has replaced the old cardinal vowel system. But it's still good to know what the cardinal vowels are about, because that representation still exists in any basic diagram that we're going to look at for vowels in any language that we're playing around with. And it also has influenced the IPA, as I mentioned before. So that's all I'm going to say about Daniel Jones and his cardinal vowels for now. And that's all I'm going to say about sort of these generalities of these features of vowels and consonants in English for the time being. When we meet again, or when you watch the next lecture video, we're going to start kind of boiling everything down to like one dimension or one aspect of phonetics at a time, and we're going to walk through the entire world of the dimensional possibilities in each lecture one by one. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you are too. And otherwise, I'm not going to say anything further for this particular lecture. It's long enough as it is. See you then.